I want to say something to you directly before anything else. Not as a hook, not as a strategy for keeping you watching, as a genuine acknowledgement of something that deserves to be said clearly and without the usual hesitation that surrounds it. If you have spent years, possibly your entire adult life, in a quiet, persistent, largely unexamined relationship with self-punishment, if the specific way you speak to yourself about your own history, your own patterns, your own repeated returns to the same painful territory has been organized around the verdict of inadequacy that you did not consciously choose, but have been faithfully executing anyway. If part of what has accompanied your survival, the actual, remarkable, genuinely costly feat of continuing to exist through everything that has made existing difficult, has been a kind of internal tribunal that never stops finding you guilty of simply not having managed it better, then this conversation is for you. Specifically, not for a general audience, for the person who has been punishing themselves for surviving. And the first thing I want to say, before the framework, before the clinical grounding, before the specific and practical account of what genuine healing from this pattern actually requires, is simply this. The survival was enough. The survival was more than enough. The survival was, in many cases, the most extraordinary thing available to do under the circumstances that required it. And it deserved something different than what the inner critic has been offering it. Gabor Maté was clear about where the self-punishment comes from. Not from accurate moral assessment, not from the honest reckoning of a self that has genuinely evaluated its own conduct against genuine standards and found genuine cause for genuine accountability. The self-punishment that follows survival comes from something older and more automatic than any of that. It comes from the internalization of an inadequate environment's response to the genuine self, from the absorption at a pre-verbal and entirely non-consensual level of the specific messages the early relational environment communicated about the self's fundamental worth. Those messages were not truth. They were the limited, often unintentional, frequently well-meaning, but genuinely inadequate expressions of people who were themselves carrying wounds that shaped what they could offer. They were the environment's response, not to who you actually were, but to who the environment had the capacity to receive. And the gap between those two things, between who you actually were and who the environment could receive, became over time the specific territory in which the self-punishment took root. Because the child who receives the message, in whatever form it arrives, explicitly or implicitly, through words or through the specific quality of emotional absence, or through the particular way that certain expressions were welcomed and others were not, a child who receives the message that who they actually are requires modification in order to be acceptable, draws a conclusion, the only conclusion available given the evidence and the developmental stage at which the evidence was received, the conclusion that the modification is necessary because the original is insufficient. And that conclusion becomes the foundation of the self-punishment, the specific, faithful, entirely logical application of the environment's verdict to every subsequent moment of the self's experience. Every pattern that repeats becomes further evidence for the verdict. Every return to the familiar difficulty becomes confirmation. Every survival, every painful, costly, genuinely remarkable act of continuing becomes, in the inner critic's framework, not evidence of resilience, but evidence of the inadequacy that required survival in the first place. This is the story that deserves to change, and the changing of it is what this conversation is actually about. But before the changing, something else needs to happen, something that is both simpler and more difficult than any technique or practice or framework for doing things differently. The grief needs to happen. Gabor Maté was consistently precise about this. Genuine change in the relationship with the self, the specific, structural, lasting kind of change that moves the organizing principle of the interior life from self-punishment towards something more genuinely compassionate, that change does not begin with better self talk or more effective practices or the deliberate cultivation of a warmer inner voice. It begins with genuine grief. Grief for the child who needed something different than what was available. Grief for the years spent organizing the interior life around the verdict that was never actually true. Grief for the energy consumed in the self punishment that could have been available for something else. Grief for the specific experiences of connection and creativity and genuine aliveness that the self punishment made less accessible than they would otherwise have been. This grief is not self pity. Gabor Maté was careful about this distinction. Self pity is organized around the wound's complaints. Genuine grief is organized around honest recognition of genuine loss. And the losses accumulated through years of self punishment for surviving are genuine. They deserve genuine acknowledgement, not as a dwelling place, as the necessary passage through which genuine change becomes available on the other side. Now, I want to give you something specific. The 7 shifts that genuine healing from self punishment for surviving actually produces, not as aspirations, but as descriptions of what becomes available when the grief is genuinely moved through and the inner relationship begins slowly and imperfectly to change. The first shift. The survival is recontextualized, not reframed in the shallow sense of deciding to feel differently about it, genuinely recontextualized, placed in the full, honest account of what it actually was and what it actually required. The survival that the inner critic has been presenting as evidence of inadequacy is, in genuine recontextualization, seen as what it actually was, an act of extraordinary resourcefulness under conditions that were genuinely difficult. The specific, intelligent, often costly deployment of whatever was available, whatever coping strategies, whatever adaptive responses, whatever forms of managing the unmanageable were accessible at the time, in the service of continuing to exist through circumstances that genuinely warranted different resources than were available. That is what survival actually is. And when it is seen clearly, without the inner critic's overlay of what should have been done differently, it tends to produce not pride exactly, but something more quiet and more lasting, a specific quality of honest respect for the self that got through, not admiration for a performance, recognition of a genuine feat. The second shift, the patterns are understood rather than condemned. The patterns that have been most consistently used as evidence in the inner critic's case against the self, the repeated return to familiar difficulty, the self sabotage, the specific behavioral expressions of the wound that have persisted despite genuine effort to change them. These begin to be seen with genuine understanding as what they actually are. Adaptations that served a genuine purpose in the context in which they were formed, running past the point of their original usefulness, not from stupidity or weakness, but from the simple fact that adaptations do not automatically update when circumstances change. This understanding does not excuse the patterns from genuine examination and genuine effort toward change, but it removes from that examination the additional and genuinely unnecessary burden of moral condemnation that the inner critic has consistently added to it. And the removal of that burden changes the quality of the work available. The person who examines their patterns from genuine curiosity rather than self-condemnation has access to considerably more genuine insight than the person whose examination is organized around the verdict they have already reached. The third shift. The inner voice changes tone before it changes content. Gabor Maté observes something important about how the inner relationship actually shifts in practice. The content of what the inner voice says, the specific judgments, the specific assessments, often changes more slowly than the tone in which it delivers them. And the tone matters more than the content, because tone is what the nervous system registers first. The message delivered in a harsh, urgent, contemptuous tone produces a different physiological response than the same message delivered in a patient, curious, genuinely kind tone, even when the message itself is the same. The daily, ordinary practice of noticing the inner voice's tone and offering the alternative, not forcing it, not performing it, simply offering the genuinely kind version, and allowing the nervous system to register the difference, is one of the most practically available and most physiologically significant aspects of genuine healing from self-punishment. The fourth shift, rest becomes genuinely permissible. This shift is more significant than it initially sounds, because one of the most consistent expressions of self-punishment for surviving is the specific inability to genuinely rest. The inner critic that is organized around the verdict of inadequacy tends to treat rest as something that must be earned through sufficient productivity or sufficient progress or sufficient evidence of not being the inadequate self that the verdict describes. And since the verdict standard for sufficiency is never quite met, genuine rest is never quite permitted. When the self-punishment begins to genuinely loosen, when the verdict that has been organizing the interior life begins to be genuinely questioned, rest becomes available in a different way. Not earned rest, simply rest. The ordinary, undefended, genuinely restorative experience of a nervous system that is not required to be continually proving something in order to justify its own existence. The fifth shift, the body is related to differently. Gabor Maté documented extensively the specific ways that chronic self-punishment manifests in the body, the specific physiological cost of a self that is continuously below the level of conscious awareness, under the judgment of an interior tribunal that never quite closes its case. The immune implications, the hormonal consequences, the specific quality of chronic, low-grade nervous system activation that sustained self-condemnation produces. As the self-punishment genuinely loosens, the body often begins to communicate differently. Not immediately, not dramatically, but genuinely over time. The chronic tension in specific locations begins to ease. The specific fatigue that belongs to continuous self-management begins gradually to lift. The body no longer required to carry quite as much of the cost of the inner critic's continuous verdict begins to redirect some of what was being spent in that management toward the regenerative processes it was always designed to run. The sixth shift. Other people's opinions of the self become interesting rather than definitive. The person whose interior verdict about themselves is organized around genuine self-punishment tends to have a specific and characteristic relationship with other people's opinions. The opinion that confirms the verdict, the criticism, the disapproval, the withdrawal of regard, is experienced not as one perspective among many, but as external confirmation of what the inner tribunal has already determined. And the opinion that contradicts the verdict, the genuine regard, the honest appreciation, the specific quality of being genuinely seen and genuinely valued, tends to produce not relief, but a particular quality of suspicious discomfort, because it does not match the verdict, and the verdict, however painful, is familiar. And familiar is, to the nervous system organized around it, close to safe. As the self-punishment genuinely loosens, this relationship with other people's opinions begins to shift. The confirming criticism loses some of its power to feel like truth, rather than simply like someone's perspective. The contradicting appreciation becomes somewhat easier to receive without the immediate reflex of deflection. Not perfectly, not immediately, but genuinely over time. The seventh shift, and this is the one that Gabor Maté considered most fundamental of all, the story changes. Not the facts of the history. Those remain what they are, real, genuinely costly, deserving of honest acknowledgement rather than minimization. But the story that is assembled from those facts, the specific narrative that organizes the meaning of what happened and what it indicates about the self that lived through it, that story begins to be told differently. Not as the story of a self that failed to manage its circumstances adequately, as the story of a self that encountered genuine difficulty with the resources genuinely available at the time and did what could be done with what was there. A self that survived not despite its inadequacy, but through its intelligence, often a specific, costly, adaptive intelligence that has been misread as inadequacy precisely because of how much it cost. The different story is not a better feeling lie about what happened. It is a more accurate account of what actually occurred. And accuracy in the interior life is more durable than comfort. Because the story that is genuinely true does not require continual effort to maintain. It does not need to be defended against the evidence, because it is not contradicted by the evidence. It is the evidence, honestly, completely, without the inner critic's overlay, read accurately at last. I want to close with something direct, because this conversation has been about something that deserves directness rather than the careful softening that so much healing content applies to genuinely difficult territory. If you have been punishing yourself for surviving, if the specific quality of your interior relationship with your own history has been organized around a verdict that says the survival was insufficient evidence of your worth, I want to say something to you that Gabor Maté said in various forms across 5 decades of sitting with people in exactly this place. That verdict was never the truth. It was the only available conclusion, given the available evidence at the time the conclusion was drawn. And the available evidence was incomplete. It did not include the full picture of what the survival actually cost and what it actually required. It did not include an accurate assessment of the conditions under which the patterns that had been used as evidence were formed. It did not include the specific, honest, complete account of what was available to you at the time you were required to navigate with it. When those things are included, genuinely, completely, without the inner critic's selective presentation of the case against the self, the verdict cannot stand. Not because the difficulty is being minimized, because the self that navigated the difficulty is being seen accurately for perhaps the first time in its full context. And in that full context, the self that has been on trial is not guilty of the charges. It survived, it adapted, it continued, and it is here, right now, in this moment. Which means that everything the survival required was somehow against whatever odds provided. That deserves something different than punishment. It deserves the specific, honest, genuinely compassionate recognition that Gabor Maté offered to every person who ever sat across from him in 50 years of clinical work. The recognition that says, I see what this cost. I understand what it required. And I want to offer you something that the environment that shaped you could not always offer. The genuine, unearned, not requiring any further demonstration, recognition that you were always, already, genuinely enough. And the privilege of a lifetime, the one Gabor Maté pointed toward with everything he had, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not the punished version, not the version organized around the verdict, who you truly are. Which has been here throughout everything, surviving, adapting, waiting with the specific patience of something that has never stopped being real for the day when the inner tribunal finally, honestly, closes the case. Today can be that day.